Hello, friends. Good to be here with you again. Today, where we'll be studying Book 6. As I had mentioned previously, Book 6 is the second longest book, or Váḥid, of the Bayán Farsi. In the Tam edition, it starts on page 184 and ends on page 238, making it about 54 pages long, with each page consisting of 19 handwritten lines. In Nicolas' French translation, Book 6 is 89 pages in length, from page 58 to 147, which takes up the greater portion of volume 3 of Le Bayán Persan. Unfortunately, only 4 excerpts from this Váḥid have been translated into English by the Baha'i World Center, and they're namely from chapters 4, 11, 15, and 16. And you will see the reason for it. The Bab introduces certain laws that were later on abrogated by Bahá'u'lláh, but very fascinating. This is a very fascinating book, and I'm sure you'll enjoy exploring it with me today. The first chapter of Book 6 is entitled On the Order of the Bayán. In this chapter, the Bab elaborates on the categorization of his writings and the manner in which revelations should be viewed and be preserved by each believer. He begins the chapter by stating the substance of this gate is that nothing is more beloved in the sight of God than moderation. So this is something that is later on reiterated by Baha'u'lláh in his revelation. So this is a wonderful new teaching that is being presented here by the Bab, and I felt that I should notify you of it, that this has been stated in the opening, even in the opening lines. Now, again, how is this moderation in respect to categorization of his writings? You'll see that in the writings of the Bab, particularly the Persian Bayán, that there is this kind of organic process in which, and you'll see that actually, I see it now more and more in the Kitab Aqdas as well, where Baha'u'lláh is talking about a certain law, and then immediately after that, he addresses one of the monarchs of the world. So moving from one subject to another in a very quick and abrupt way, it seems to be. It actually seems to me that it highlights it. It kind of underscores as you move from one thought to another. So here, the Bab continues. Later on in this chapter, he writes, should one be the most learned of his day in each branch of knowledge, yet fail to recognize the one true God, what benefit would his knowledge offer him? For true knowledge must stem from the knowledge of God and the knowledge of his messenger and the manifestations of his cause and authority. Towards the end of this first chapter of Book 6, the Bab, speaking of the Bayán as the designation for all his writings. So the Bayán, it is not just the book, the 2 books that are entitled Bayán Farsi and the Bayán Arabi. He refers to the entire body of his writings, and later on to his own revelation as the Bayán. So here he states, say, gain ye certitude in that which God hath revealed in the Bayán, for understanding the Bayán is dependent on understanding the totality of its revelation from beginning to the end. For that which was revealed first is based upon the Quranic laws, only later were the true measures of the dispensation of the Bayán manifested. So here he's talking about now the early writings. For example, the Qayyum al-Asma was based on Quranic laws, and it was a commentary on the Surah of Joseph. Whereas, as you will see in the writings of the third period, which Bayán Farsi is in, you're seeing a complete independence. I mean, not complete independence in the sense that there's no quotations from the Quran, you will see that in the Bayan that he does quote, maybe excerpts once in a while, but you don't see it as ubiquitous in his writings and as prevalent in his writings as it was in the early period. So again, you'll see that there's this organic shift and this new development, in the Bab's writings, which Dr. Saidi in his book has wonderfully has explained and goes into it in great depth. The Bab continues, neither be ye shrouded from the later writings by the earlier writings, nor fix your eyes merely on the later writings and ignore the earlier ones. So he's saying here that they all have validity in the same way that, we look at the revelation of Baha'u'lláh and the writings, for example, of Baha'u'lláh in the early years before his open declaration, namely in the Baghdad period. I mean, some of his most significant works, the Kitab-i-Iqan, the Four Valleys, the Seven Valleys, the Hidden Words, Jawahir al-Asrar, these were all revealed prior to Baha'u'llah's open declaration. So it was revealed in the period of concealment. And so in the early writings, the Bab very similarly had declared himself as the gate of God, Bábí-Religion, whereas he had not claimed to be the Qa'im of the House of Muhammad. He does that in the third period, in fact, in 1848. So again, this is where he's talking about. And then he goes on to say, yet the later the revelation of the writings, the more manifest is the divine intention therein. Obviously, it's a lot more clear, with Qayyum al-Asma, you would have to read between the lines, and some of the writings were not as explicit or as far as his references and allusions to, for example, him whom God shall make manifest, or distinctions of himself. Whereas in the Persian Bayán, it's very, very clear. So verily, all the Bayan is the word of the point of truth, he says. So I think this really distinguishes how the Bab wishes for us to really look at his writings here, and he's given us a kind of an insight into that, which is very fascinating. Unfortunately, no parts of chapter 1 has been translated into English by the Baha'i World Center. This chapter consists of about 92 handwritten lines in the original language. In chapter 2, the Bab abrogates the Islamic law concerning the purity of water and any interpretations made throughout the course of Islam by the doctors of the Muslim faith as to what constitutes as pure water in a religious context. The Bab states that proper sanitation is enough to preserve the purity of water. He also adds that in the sight of God, both the purity of the inner temple as well as the outer temple is important. He then warns his followers not to commit that which the Muslims have committed in the day of his advent by diligently practicing purification of their outer temple and yet being deprived of purification of their inner temple, which is none other than the recognition of God's manifestation on the promised day. Now, this law really has a tremendous relevance to particularly Muslims in that for the 1200 years, there have been not only the law from the Quran on purity, but later on commentaries of what constitutes pure water, because, primarily in the land of its birth, and later on in the Middle East, and even during that time, we're talking about even in Europe, this was the Middle Ages, where people were dying of the Black Plague, and mortality rates were very high. So and there were a lot of disease and infectious illnesses that were very prevalent. So this kind of purity, and a lot of that those disease was transmitted through impure waters. So hence the purity of the water had a not only just a purification in the sense of a spiritual sense, and wanting to be, you know, when one is conversing with his or her creator, to be in a state of cleanliness and purity on a sort of outwardly, but it was also that to minimize individuals being infected with all sorts of disease which was in the water, you know, and so on. So here the Bab, but it had gone out of control. I mean, there were so many things, and you'll see that particularly in the Shia interpretation, that, you know, with the purity of certain animals. We also saw in the previous book about the cleanliness and the purity of semen. So these are all related to what the Bab is now saying, that, you know, the most important is really the purification of the inner temple, although the outer temple needs to be also clean and purified. But don't spend so much of your energy and time on the outer, and try to spend more of your time on the inner purification. In this context, he writes, "Know verily that in the sight of God, any heart that has in it anything but the love of God is not considered pure." So again, he says that this is really the foundational, that you have to have the love of God, you have to be devoted to his will and purpose, and that is really ultimately the essence of purity. Further on in this chapter, the Bab states that no followers of any faith is more concerned about their physical purity than the Christian community, yet one can see where they are spiritually. So again, he gives an example that you can be clean and pure as much as you want, but if you're not guided, you know, he's referring to the fact that the Christian community have not embraced Islam. And at this point, you know, at the time, there weren't many Christian converts to the cause of the Bab as well, even though he forecasted that there will be in future years, which obviously has occurred. In the last few lines of this chapter, the Bab writes, "It would be a worthy act if at all times every believer could preserve his or her sense of smell through the use of perfumes, so that he could not whiff any aroma except the fragrance of my love." It's again a very beautiful passage here, but also has a certain, you know, physical significance, because as you all know that once we are exposed to a certain noxious smell or odor, eventually our body, if we're exposed to it for a very long time, we became used to it. The body kind of desensitizes itself to it. And so he basically says that your sense of smell should not be neutered, if you will, by the fact that, you know, if you're exposed to a malodorous odor, you know, to something that is fetid, something that is, you know, that is pungent. And so by using perfume, that kind of refreshes your, you know, your sense of smell. So you can actually, you know, distinguish other odors as well, both good and bad. And this also later on, obviously Bahá'u'lláh has in the Kitab Aqdas, where he says "Ista'malu ma'al ward summa itral khalis," where he says take, you know, use perfumes. So again, that has been encouraged for the Baha'is, but I see that this is also a kind of the foundation on which later on Bahá'u'lláh has built you know, a commandment, you know, and you'll see that very often in the Bayán, that in fact some of the laws that we're going to be exploring today, the foundations were set by the Bab in the Bayán, and then Baha'u'lláh has built on that, you know, in the Kitab Aqdas, or completely abrogated it. Unfortunately, as I said, no parts of this chapter has been translated by the Baha'i World Center. The chapter is a medium size, about 53 handwritten lines in the original language. Moving on to chapter 3. Although chapter 3 begins with these words, on that God hath ordained that his servants should build in every village a cleansing house or a public bathhouse, the Bab also comments on a couple of other important topics in this chapter. Speaking of the concept of refinement, he writes, in this religion, no other command is as rigorously enjoined as the duty of refinement, and it is forbidden that one bring any object into being in a state of imperfection when one hath the power to manifest it in full perfection. He continues, he says, for example, should one build an edifice and fail to elevate it to the utmost state of perfection possible for it, there would be no moment in the life of that edifice when angels would not beseech God to torment him. Nay, rather, all the atoms of that edifice would do the same. It's very fascinating. For each thing within its own station yearneth to attain unto the utmost height of excellence in its own level. The Bab continues, thus should a man who is capable not realize and respond to the yearning of his capability, he will be held accountable therefore. It is ordained in this religion to design the doors of each place to allow a tall man to enter through them without bending his neck. It behooveth them each day to build all the places in the utmost manner of exaltation possible at that time, so that happily in the day of the revelation of God, nothing that causeth grief may be witnessed in his kingdom. So this is an aspiration for excellence in all things, again. And here the Bab, for example, gives an example of building and structure. So he says when you're going to be building something, it has to be well thought of and well engineered. And I think this is now something that in the West is very much practiced. And I think as the sciences of engineering, civil engineering has elevated to such a degree that then bridges and buildings are built with optimal safety standards, as well as comfort and the durability and so on and so forth. So again, this is something that the Bab is encouraging, that in general, that we must really try to aspire to our true potential. Another thing that really this talks or this speaks to me here is the fact that in life there are certain gifts that you're given, which is part of your potential. But it is really up to our volition, our conscious choice to make that manifest. Baha'u'lláh says, and this passage has been translated by Shobi Effendi in the Gleanings, is all that which ye potentially possess can only be manifested as a result of your own volition. So what we have potentially in all of us, hidden, the talents, gifts, can only become a reality if we choose to make it a reality. And this also goes back to what Abdul Baha says, that our reality as human beings are our thoughts. If we think in a certain way, then we will be in that way. So this for me, for example, there are people who, their inner talent is really, for example, to be an artist, to be a musician or a painter or something like that. And then, but they're being compelled by their family to go on to study another profession, like to be a lawyer or to be a doctor or something like that. Not to say that any of those are not good, but I mean, not everybody is cut out for a particular profession. I think we all have our own hidden gifts and talents, and I think we need to follow that. And I think this is what also reading this excerpt from the Bayán really speaks to me personally, that our true perfection can only be realized if we follow what foundationally has been we've been gifted by God. A few lines later in this short chapter, the Bab makes a veiled reference to the year 19 as the final date of the advent of him whom God shall make manifest. Now, the Bab, and this has been discussed in Dr. Saïdi's book, but also in many of the literature of the Baha'i faith, as well as God Passes By, about that the Bab has made references to two dates, if you will, or has allusions to the year 9, which was the concealed revelation, the birth of the Baha'i revelation on the 2nd of Muharram, 1852, which are 1269, while Baha'u'lláh was immured in the dungeon of Siyah Chal, and the Guardian refers to it as his hidden declaration, Ishar Amr Khafi. And then there is Baha'u'llah's private yet open declaration in the Garden of Rizwan, which was the 19 years from the period if we look at the sort of the years from the revelation of the Bab and to Baha'u'llah's declaration. So that's the 19 years. So here, this is Baha'u'llah, the Bab is making a reference to the year 19 here. As to the revelation of him whom God shall make manifest, God knoweth the age at which he maketh him to become manifest. This is very, very interesting. That again, this is in consonance with what Abdu'l-Baha has stated, that all the manifestations of God are manifestations of God from the day that they are born, yet they are in a state of inactivity or sleep. And this is where Baha'u'lláh, and I've explained this in many of my webinars and talks and writings, that when Baha'u'lláh, for example, in Loh Sultan says, "O king, I was asleep upon my couch when lo, the breezes of the All-Merciful wafted over me and awakened me and beckoned me to raise my voice." That is, Abdu'l-Baha comments that in some answered questions, that's when Baha'u'llah's revelation became activated, where, or to put it in a more simpler terms, that's where the manifestation of God is given his marching orders, or as I would like to call it, his investiture as the manifestation of God. So Baha'u'lláh was manifestation of God in waiting until the 2nd of Muharram, 1269, October 16th, 1852, where revelation came to him and beckoned him, and he was empowered by God, and that was the birth of the Baha'i revelation in the dungeon of Siyah Chal. So in this way, the Bab is saying that God knows at what time, when exactly him whom God shall make manifest is going to be revealed or will be manifested. Now, he doesn't say outwardly manifested or inwardly manifested. In this case, it was an inward manifestation for 10 years. It was the period of concealment, Ayyam Butun. However, from the inception of the revelation to the number of unity, which is 19 years, take heed and be watchful, inasmuch as each year the faith of the believers will be manifested through the affirmation of a different letter, after which they will not be able to manifest the fruits of the past revelation except through the next revelation. Even as anyone who hath been associated with the early days of this revelation would have witnessed that they refused to let the manifestation of the fruit of 1270 years reveal himself beyond the station of gatehood. So this is, again, the Bab is now making a reference to the fact that even in the early part of his revelation, he was, his station was a station of gatehood. And Baha'u'lláh in several of his tablets have made explicit reference to this, that the Bab originally declared himself as Bábulláh. And you see that in the excerpts translated of Qayyumul Asma, in the selections from the writings of the Bab, that you will see that he's not claiming to be the Qa'im, whereas in the third period he completely unveils himself and he declares himself as the Qa'im, in the same way that Baha'u'lláh, with his monumental proclamatory letters to the kings and rulers in 1866 with Surat al-Muluk and Surah Haykal, that he completely unveiled his station, his beauty. And you'll see that, in fact, in the Surat al-Muluk, in the first paragraph, Baha'u'lláh actually introduces himself to the kings and says, my name is Hussein, this is my station, and so on and so forth. So again, here the Báb is disclosing the plan of God of how revelation is, even the unveiling of the manifestation is done in a progressive way. So we have progressive revelation, but yet within the revelation there is progressions as well. It seems to be the hallmark of God, and also the revelation of or the method by which he manifests his manifestations. Again, moving on. Unfortunately, no parts of chapter 3 has been translated. The excerpts that I shared with you were from Dr. Sa'idi's book. With only 27 handwritten lines in the original language, chapter 3 is among the shorter chapters of book 6, yet one of the more important chapters because of his references to him whom God shall make manifest. But the chapter begins with establishing public bathhouses in each village. So again, to promote the concept of cleanliness and purity, or out of purity, but yet the Báb also highlights the date of the second coming, his own second coming, and the coming of him whom God shall make manifest. Very fascinating. In chapter 4, only a small section of chapter 4 of book 6 has been translated into English by the Baha'i World Center. The entire chapter 4 consists of 58 handwritten lines in the original language. So these are the excerpts that we have, the first excerpts of book 6 that have been translated by the Baha'i World Center, and you can find them in selections from the writings of the Báb. The Báb writes, the one true God may be compared unto the sun, and the believer unto a mirror. No sooner is the mirror placed before the sun than it reflects its light. The unbeliever may be likened unto a stone. No matter how long it is exposed to the sunshine, it cannot reflect the sun. Thus, the former layeth down his life as a sacrifice, while the latter doeth against God what he committeth. Indeed, if God willeth, he is potent to turn the stone into a mirror, but the person himself remaineth reconciled to his state. Had he wished to become a crystal, God would have made him to assume crystal form. So again, I see in this is the concept of free will, that we all have the capacity, we all have been invested with the capacity, but it is really the choices that we make. And the friends of God that are today are believers in the manifestation of God for this day, Baha'u'lláh, are the ones who have made the choice. And so we need to feel very grateful that we've made that choice, because others, obviously, the majority of humanity has as yet made that choice. Moving on, the Báb writes, for on that day, whatever cause prompteth the believer to believe in him, the same will also be available to the unbeliever. But when the latter suffereth himself to be wrapped in veils, the same cause shutteth him out as by a veil. Thus, as is clearly evident today, those who have set their faces toward God, the true one, have believed in him because of the Bayán, while such as are veiled have been deprived because of it. In chapter 5, the Báb introduces the ordinance of greeting and salutation. He states that when male believers come upon each other, one should salute with the greeting Allahu Akbar, God is great, and the other person return the salutation with the greeting Allahu A'zam, God is the most great. Similarly, for women, I found that this very fascinating, should greet each other with Allahu Abha, God is glorious, or the most glorious, and answer with Allahu Ajmal, God is the most beauteous, or God is beauteous. So I think here the women were one step ahead with Allah Abha. But again, and this is something that, if you recall in Baha'i history, that after the most great separation, March 10th, 1866, where Baha'u'lláh basically excommunicated Azal and his followers, and he repaired to the house of Reza Beg in Adrianople. What the Guardian says, that the believers were encouraged, and later on they adopted more frequently of the greeting of Allah Abha, and where the Bábís were still greeting each other with Allahu Akbar. So again, that's how it became also distinguishable who was a Bábí and who was not a Bábí, who was a follower of Baha'u'lláh, perhaps. So unfortunately, no parts of this chapter has been translated into English by the Baha'i World Center, nor any parts of it have been discussed by Dr. Saidi in his book. But I felt I wanted to share with you what the actual salutation was. And the Bab goes, obviously, with every new law, he goes extensively and explains the wisdom behind it, and offers at times somewhat of abstruse commentary about the significance of these things. But ultimately, all of them are there to prepare the way for the coming of him whom God shall make manifest, and create really a new creation in humanity, and really what you see in the revelation of the Bab, that I have explained in the past as well, or how I see it, is that the Bab, took the revelation of Islam and completely transformed it, in his own revelation, dramatically, in a revolutionary way. Almost, to use an analogy, is almost like bulldozing, the tree of Islam in such a way, but maintaining certain elements, but really, preparing the way for the revelation of Baha'u'lláh. And that was no easy task. And so that's why you'll see all these dramatic laws that you will see, that are very dramatic and very harsh, as the Guardian says, but they were really there to uproot the previous laws and make the land more, to furrow the land, if you will, to prepare the land for the planting of the new laws, for the new millennium, for the millennium, for the new revelation, for the new cycle of fulfillment, Baha'u'llah's revelation. So it was a very arduous and formidable task, for the Bab to do that. But you'll see that with the Bayán, definitely, as that revolutionizing vehicle by which we have this transformation that took place, from Islam and Shia Islam and Sunni Islam all the way to what we have, in the revelation of Baha'u'lláh. Moving on to chapter 6, the Bab begins chapter 6 with the highly controversial and well-documented law of the destruction of all books except such as have been or shall be composed in this cause. Now, some of the friends had asked that in the previous book whether that was a reference. No, this is a chapter 6 is where the Bab very clearly states that all the books have to be, and one of the students had asked whether the Quran was included in there. Well, he does say only the book composed in this cause. So in some ways, what he is saying, everything, even though he has elevated, both him and Baha'u'lláh have elevated the station of the Quran, but the Quran has expired as far as the Bab is concerned, that they were, at the time of the resurrection, which he has spoken about, this is a renewal, where there is the old is the old. I mean, there is respect for it. Now, Baha'u'lláh obviously has abrogated this law, which would have been a very divisive and problematic law if it was still in effect. But you can see that it's really trying to, the Bab here is showing that by creating this kind of an injunction, by creating this such a harsh and such a clear and resolute command, that he is basically saying what is in the past is no longer valid. So don't hold on to the past. So, and I'm commanding you to abandon it. So for that period, and you know, you can just imagine that all the believers that were Bábís at the time, I mean, Quran was such a part of their religion, and all these other books as well, you know. So, but here, this is that kind of emancipation, the spiritual emancipation that the Bab is creating here through this law. Of course, Baha'u'lláh in paragraph 77, and later on in his writings as well, I think in the 10th Bisharat, the glad tidings, the 10th glad tiding, he makes reference to it as well. But he makes it very clear. He says, God hath relieved you of the ordinance laid down in the Bayán concerning the destruction of books. We have permitted you to read such sciences as are profitable unto you, not such as end in idle disputation. Better is this for you if ye be of them that comprehend. So through the grace of God, we now can read Shakespeare and the poetry of Rumi and all the other great works and other great authors in various languages as well. So, but yet, you know, the Bab's point really was there, that so we should not be veiled by other writings, because so often people hold on to a certain defunct belief and notions and creeds and doctrines that are invalid. And yet this is what the Bab is trying to do, is just to kind of uproot those notions and allow the minds to be clear and be ready for him whom God shall make manifest. Later in this chapter, the Bab reiterates what we had expressed earlier in, what he had expressed earlier in Book 5, Chapter 8, regarding the superior nature of the verses which would be revealed by him whom God shall make manifest. So this is a reiteration of the previously pronouncement that the Bab had made. And here the Bab writes, in the day of him whom God shall make manifest, to recite one verse of his verses would be better than to peruse the entire Bayán and all that hath been established therein. And you'll see that this is magnificent. You know, this is unprecedented. This level of explicit directness by one manifestation in regards to the other manifestation, or the pending manifestation or the imminent manifestation that is to come. So, and this is something that Baha'u'lláh has quoted in his writings, that, you know, even some of it has been translated into English, where the Baha'u'lláh uses this verse from that, you know, that my writings are the writings that the Bab said that it's better to read them, one verse of it versus the entire Bayán. And this is, as I said at the early part of the course, the reason why the priority by the Baha'i World Center not to necessarily translate the writings of the Bab, or the urgency of it, is because the Bab himself would have wanted it that way, that the writings of Baha'u'lláh would take precedence over his writings, that there would be more writings of Baha'u'lláh available to the world than his own writings. Again, no parts of this chapter has been discussed or been translated by either Baha'i World Center or Dr. Saidi. It consists of about 30 handwritten lines, so it's one of the shorter chapters, or medium-sized chapters. There are some really short ones that we're gonna encounter in the latter part of this this book as well. Chapter 7, with 195 handwritten lines in the original language, Chapter 7 is the longest chapter of Book 6. And yet, there's no parts of it that have been translated by the Baha'i World Center. The main theme of this chapter is marriage. However, after setting down the requirements and provisions of marriage, the Bab gets into a long and extensive commentary on faith and the duty of recognition of each soul in every revelation of God. About the marriage, and again, we're going to talk about this a little bit here as well, the more of the spiritual significance of it, which is very fascinating. The marriage laws of the Bab are essentially are the foundational for what later on was reaffirmed and reiterated and enhanced by Baha'u'lláh. And as you've read in the Kitab Aqdas, one of the fundamental differences is that, and in the revelation of the Bab, you didn't need a parental consent. Basically, if the two individuals mutually agreed to marry one another, and they had witnesses and they recited the verse, essentially that, and paid the dowry, then the marriage was enacted. Whereas Baha'u'lláh has in the Kitab Aqdas ordained that parental consent needs to be another requirement of the marriage. So, but the foundation essentially is the same of the one that the Bab had declared here in the Bayán. Now, exploring this, and this is something that also Dr. Saidi has gone into it, very interesting. So I'll share with you some elements of this long chapter. In his book, Dr. Saidi describes some aspects of this chapter. He writes, one of the most extensive discussion of action for God is carried out in Gate 7 of the 6th unity of the Persian Bayán in connection with the law of marriage. According to the Bab, marriage becomes lawful if both parties utter a sentence vowing that their action is for God, lillah. And this is this verse still, we have that a version of this which is still used as lillah, inna kullun lillah radun, and again for female is raziyat, I believe. Again, I have to check my Arabic on that, but again, we will all verily abide by the will of God. So this is where the Bab goes into the significance of this lillah, which is for God, the concept of for God. So this is what Dr. Saidi is explaining. Now the verse, verily I abide by the will of God, or I am for God, the Lord of the heavens, the Lord of the earth, the Lord of all things, the Lord of all of that which is visible and that which is unseen, the Lord of all the worlds. This is the verse. Now, continuing on this, Saidi states that in this law, the Bab fixes the limit of the dowry at 95 mesqal of gold for the city dweller and 95 mesqal of silver for the village dweller. Now, very interesting. He says minimum 19 mesqal of gold or silver up to 95. Baha'u'lláh has made it basically 19, you know. But here, the Bab had set actually an upper limit and a lower limit of it, whereas Baha'u'lláh has fixed an amount and say, just stick with the 19, you know, 19 mesqal of gold for the city dweller who can afford gold, and then for the less, you know, fortunate materially, village dweller and people in developing nations and so on, it would be the value of silver. So again, then he explains about the 95 is the numerical value of for God. So this is now we get into the mystical aspect of this element of lillah. So the law of marriage, and this is Dr. Saidi's translation of this excerpt, the law of marriage is ordained thus that all may abide beneath the bounty of God's grace and mercy and fix their eye upon that which is the basis of the lawfulness of marriage, which is not but the words for God, that happily in the day of the revelation of him whom God shall make manifest, they will not deviate from the supreme mirror of these words, the one who testifieth unto God. I had an extra H here. Now, moving on to chapter 8 is one of the most important gates of the Bayán according to the Báb. Such is its importance of this chapter 8 that he commands that every believer should read and reflect on its contents at least once in every 19 days, or once a month, once a Bábí month or Baha'i month. The entire chapter consists of about 58 handwritten lines in the original language, and unfortunately no parts of it have been translated into English by the Baha'i World Center, but we have some translations here that we're going to share with you. This is my translation of the first sections of it. So the chapter 8 begins with these words: on that he who ventureth to establish his argument without the book of God and the verses of the Bayán, the like of which all are powerless to reproduce, hath no valid argument. And he who attempts to produce a miracle without relying on the verses of the Bayán hath no proof. But he who claims to reveal verses of God should not be opposed by anyone. Ye must read this gate once every 19 days and reflect on that which hath been revealed therein by day and by night. Now, so there is 3 parts to this first quotation here, where, and the first 2 is about hujjiyat ayat, as he refers to it, which is the proof of the verses. As you know, both Baha'u'lláh and the Báb have allowed their followers to only use the verses of God to substantiate the validity of these revelations. We cannot use miracles. There have been miracles or miraculous events in the history, in the annals of both Bábí and Baha'i histories, but we are not allowed to. It's been forbidden, categorically forbidden. We can share, and read it together and be fascinated by it, but we cannot use it as a basis for our argument, as it was and has been in the past revelations, particularly Christianity that comes to mind about the miracle of the resurrection or Jesus walking on water and so on and so forth. Whereas here, it's all about the verses. Now, the third component of this statement by the Báb is that he says, he who claims to reveal verses of God should not be opposed. Now, it's very interesting. So he says, anybody who claims that their verses, that he's revealing verses, you should not oppose them. Now, okay, but how about those so-called false claimants? He says that, and later on, and I think we're gonna read a bit of it later. He says no one can actually reveal verses unless they're empowered by God. So, and you will know it. He says essentially what they're gonna reveal is or what they're gonna write, if they're imposters, it's gonna be rubbish, and people are gonna see through it, as they did with Azal and later on through the breaker of the covenant of Baha'u'lláh, his son and half-brother of Abdul Baha, Mirza Muhammad Ali. Okay? So people can see through that. So he says only the one who has been empowered, who has been manifested by God, can reveal. So to protect the one who is going to be manifest soon, he says, don't oppose them. First of all, he gives this carte blanche. Don't oppose anyone who claims that they're revealers of verses. This goes back also to the tradition about the Qa'im as well, that you are to investigate the cause of the Qa'im. In fact, there is a tradition that I recall, and I think it's in Bahá'u'lláh, volume 13, where if you are disabled, that you cannot walk, you must pull yourself, even if it's harsh weather, it's a snow or it's cold, you must pull yourself on the ground and try to reach the person who is making a claim to be the Qa'im of the House of Muhammad. So this is how important, I think, the significance of it, no matter whether you're disabled or not, you must go and seek out him whom God shall make manifest, or the Qa'im of the House of Muhammad. So this is very much in consonance with the previous declaration that whoever makes this claim, people have to be open to it, okay? Obviously, they have to be open to it and allow that individual to make their claim, and then you make an assessment whether it's truth or whether it's true or false. So continuing later in this chapter, the Bab states that the primary reason for enjoining on every believer the command to read this chapter regularly is so that at the time of the advent of him whom God shall make manifest, no one would be veiled from recognizing him. He further adds that the greatest proof and testimony is revelation of verses which no one but God is capable of producing. So he says, if that individual is from God, you will know that these are the verses of God. And many of the early believers immediately recognized. What comes to mind is Hujjat Zanjani. It's in the Dawnbreakers, where he was the head of a very large congregation. He was a very popular orator and a great teacher of Shia Islam, and Mullah Muhammad Ali Zanjani. And once they brought him an excerpt from the writings of the Bab, he looked at it, he read it, he kissed it, and then he said, "This is from God." And then he basically closed his shop, if you will, or closed his study classes, and said, "The Qa'im has arrived." I mean, that is absolutely incredible, of what a purity of heart, and again, what erudition, true erudition comes from that he was not veiled whatsoever. He read the verses and he said, the Qa'im is here. So that's what really ultimately what God wants from his creatures, to be able to not be veiled. But unfortunately, majority of us, we become veiled by what has been what surrounds us, and what tries to indoctrinate us, or has indoctrinated us in the past. And everybody has had their own journey, especially the people who have embraced the faith through their own personal journeys, as opposed to being blessed to be born, let's say, in a Baha'i family, and then discovering the faith through that channel. The Bab then goes on to write, notwithstanding this impossibility of the revelation of verses, that none besides him whom God shall make manifest will be able to claim such a mighty cause. It is enjoined in the Bayán that should anyone make a claim and verses be manifested from him, no one should oppose him. That happily no grief should assail the Son of Truth. His verses are by themselves sufficient proof of the radiant light of the Sun of his being, just as the powerlessness of all is the mighty evidence of the utter need and dependence of all upon him. Beautifully stated. He continues by stating that the reason for this command is that happily in the day of the revelation of that supreme truth, the feet of the people shall not falter upon the bridge, upon the Sirat. Remember the Sirat, that bridge? And that they shall not pronounce judgment against the fashioner of their existence, adducing against him the very shadow of his verse in their heart, and rendering not at once all their inmost realities and deeds without even perceiving it. In chapter 9, moving on to chapter 9, so that was chapter 8, very, very significant, very important chapter. In chapter 9, the Bab abrogates Islamic prohibition of wearing silk clothing and using utensils made out of silver and gold. No parts of this chapter has been translated into English by the Baha'i World Center. The chapter consists of about 27 handwritten lines. So this is, again, break from the past. And I think there's an example of this even prior to Bob's open declaration. Well, when he traveled to Karbala and sat at one of the classes of Sayyid Kazim Rashti and had a discourse with him. And then during one of their meetings, I think he drank from a cup that was either silver or gold and offered it to Sayyid Kazim, and Sayyid Kazim also took that. So, that is a sign that he knew the station of the Bab at that time, that Sayyid Ali Muhammad from Shiraz, who had come, that young man who was probably at that time no more than 20 years old, 20, 21 years old, because that was about a couple of years before the Bab declared. So somewhere in early 20s. So it's truly incredible, that episode, and you can read that in the Dawnbreakers as well. And there's a passage in the selections from the writings of the Bab, I believe is in the Kitab Asma, the Book of Names, where he talks about that. He picks up on this, and he says that that it is, it is God has ordained that his loved ones enjoy wearing silk clothing if they want to. In fact, this later on, Baha'u'lláh talks about that, all the great beauties and the advantages of life has really been created for the believers, and they should partake on that as a sign of gratitude for God. But one has to be detached from it. There's a passage by Abdul Baha beautifully expressed. He says, Abdul Baha says that detachment does not imply lack of means. It is marked by the freedom of the heart. Your heart has to be detached from it. So the Bab says you can wear the silk, and in that passage, and I'm paraphrasing, and he says, but yet he wants you to have the rectitude of conduct, to be God-fearing, to be following his will and purpose. And yet, if you can afford it, you should wear the silk. If you cannot afford it, at least be, possess those qualities of God-fearing and the virtues of God. So here again, there's this emancipation, that these restrictions, and you'll see that with restrictions with purity, with animals, all of these things are again signs of the fact that he is just, creating a leveling field, if you will, for plantation of new laws and new spiritual verities to come by him whom God shall make manifest. In chapter 10, the Bab enjoins upon every believer to wear a ring with a red cornelian, just aqir ahmar, he refers to it, stone. So like the ones that we wear today with the symbol, the ringstone symbol of the greatest name, if you will, which would have the following verses inscribed on it. And this would be inscribed on this: say, verily God is the truth, all else but God are his creation, and everyone worships him. This is the verse that he says you should inscribe on that stone, and it's the red cornelian stone, which is a semi-precious stone. It's not a very, and it's very popular in particularly northern part of Iran. It comes from Khorasan and that area, like turquoise, but it's a less, or perhaps other parts of the country. But very common. You see that even today, many Persian men and women wear this aqir, this aqir al-ahmar, this red aqir. No parts of this chapter has been translated, and it's about 32 handwritten lines in the original language. So we're going to take a little break here to reload the camera, so to speak, and just have a little break, and then we'll come back and finish off the second half of this chapter or this book.